we tend to withdraw. Like for me, that's what used to happen. I would withdraw. Like I see conflict coming at me, and I'm like, I will zone out in front of somebody. They will say whatever they want to say, but I won't be listening. So, so really the conflict is not being resolved. And then what will happen is I'll go back into my quiet place and I'll probably be ruminating about that problem, not for a day, but for several days, sometimes weeks, sometimes months. Hi everyone, welcome back. This is Lilian Okado on the I Am Unafraid podcast. Really happy to be back doing this episode today, which is on conflict. Now, why conflict? Because we deal with conflict every single day, and especially right now in our country, Kenya. For those who have been following the political news that has been happening here locally, we find that the Gen Zs and the millennials have been on the streets just leading peaceful demonstrations against what we are calling the 2024 finance bill. So we are on a hashtag reject finance bill 2024 season. And so it has been a very enlightening season. And when I was thinking about this podcast, I actually thought about it even before this past week that we've had where there's been conflict within the youth and the government, right? And just generally a lot of Kenyans who are not happy with what's going on. And it just really emphasized what I've been thinking about for a long time, that even I personally have struggled with. Okay, I've struggled with conflict in the sense of handling conflict, communicating conflict. And I think a lot of us out here, especially let's put it in the Gen X generation, which I'm part of, and the millennial generation, the older millennial generation. So I'll give you an example. Something that happened to me a couple of years ago after I had just gotten, I'm a mom to, and I'm parenting my 10-year-old right now alone. I've been doing that since I gave birth. And before that, obviously, I did not plan to be a single parent or parenting a child on my own. And I remember, for me, it was one of those things that I was not ready for mentally and emotionally. And kind of like I was living in regret when I found out that I was going to be a mom on my own. And all those things that single parents go through, when they just discover that, oh my God, you're not going to have a partner with you by your side, raising your child with you. So I remember I was very, very, like I've said this in other podcasts, that I was very, very upset with my ex-partner at that time. And I remember communicating, my family, obviously, now my immediate family, obviously learned about what was happening. And I remember someone in my family, I remember, I guess in hindsight now I look at it, it was coming from a point of love, but the way they communicated to me their disapproval or them just not being happy with the situation that I was a single parent, I was being a single mother. It was during a conflict situation. And they ended up saying a lot of things that really took away from the actual conflict that we had with each other with regards to something totally unrelated to the fact that I am a mother, And it took me a couple of years before I got over that situation and I let go of the conflict the feeling that it left with me. But what I also realized from that was just that my loved one in that situation just didn't know how to communicate, and so they used the fact that I was a single parent as as a weapon. They kind of weaponized it and made me feel really, really bad about being a single parent. But in hindsight, like I said, I realized it was just their way of communicating their own hurt in the situation, because sometimes you don't realize it that people who care about us also get hurt when we get hurt. So that's one. And then I remember another scenario where, again, just years ago, between myself and someone that I call a friend or called a friend, I remember now it was me who didn't communicate my feelings of conflict with them with love. And I'm one of those people who is very honest most of the time. I strive to be honest in terms of how I communicate with people. So I remember just literally just calling out a situation. And what happened was, and it was a genuine call out, like I genuinely needed to call out the situation because this friend of mine had done something that was really affecting myself and was also affecting the business. But I remember the way I communicated was not necessarily kind, again, in hindsight, because, wisdom comes in hindsight sometimes. And I realized that there could have been a better way in which I could have said, hey, I am not happy with how you are running things or doing things in life that are affecting my life directly. But instead, I remember I just literally, what's the word? The way you expose someone in front of other people? So we were in this meeting, and in that meeting, we were like, I guess we were working together on some project, and there were multiple people on that project. But because they had not been pulling their weight on the project, and I was getting frustrated because I'm like, first of all, we are all adults. You're an adult, then you're my friend, and now because we are working together as friends on this project, it's really hard. And sometimes it's hard to call out your own friends in situations. But now, because I just didn't have the language to communicate my frustration, what happened is I just literally called her out in the meeting and embarrassed her, and she was really, really angry with me. And it kind of caused a rift in our relationship for a while. But of course, we later sorted that out. But that for me was a big learning lesson because immediately I just felt I shouldn't have done that, So that being said, yeah, I know many of us, we do struggle with communicating in conflict situations. So I've learned a couple of tips over the years, and I think nowadays I'm much better at conflict. Or communicating in conflict. So one of the first tips that I can share that have helped me deal with this issue is that we need to recognize that, first of all, we have a communication problem. It's very difficult to deal with conflict if you're not aware. And remember, in my previous podcast, I talked about the importance of becoming self-aware. So if you're not aware that you have a communication problem, you're just going to go around hurting people with your words. And I think it's important that that's the first thing before you approach anyone to deal with an issue you have with them. And it's a hot-heated issue. Please, if you know you have a communication problem, it is important that you sit down and ask yourself, do I have a communication problem? And if you do, first deal with that before you approach handling the conflict. Now, the second thing is also to understand that our fear of conflict usually has many layers, okay? So it has many layers. For starters, for example, sometimes we don't like to deal with conflict. So I have been a big avoidant. Like, I'm really all love and peace and happiness, kind of person. Roses and, bells and whistles. I mean, I'm that person. I don't like conflict. I don't like to hurt people. But, in life, you cannot go through life without hurting anyone, right? Including yourself. So it's important to also understand why we have conflict and the different layers of conflict. For example, you don't want to break up with people. You don't want to break up, and this is not necessarily just in your relationship with the opposite sex. It's even with your relationship in your family. Like, a lot of people will run away from dealing with issues in their family because they are afraid to break up with people in their family. They're afraid to break up with their friends. They're afraid to break up with their bosses, kind of thing. But usually what I ask, what is worse? Your fear of dealing with an issue and staying in fear, or dealing with the issue? What is better? Would you rather continue staying in fear? Because what happens is we tend to then not learn to develop the language of conflict that I have mentioned earlier, meaning that there is a language for conflict or how to communicate. We tend to withdraw. Like, for me, that's what used to happen. I would withdraw. Like, I see conflict coming at me, and I'm like, I will zone out in front of somebody. They will say whatever they want to say, but I won't be listening. So really the conflict is not being resolved. And then what will happen is I'll go back into my quiet place, and I'll probably be ruminating about that problem, not for a day, but for several days, sometimes weeks, sometimes months. And then what happens is, because I have avoided the conflict, I have run away from it, I may come a year later to start discussing a conflict that happened a year ago, or maybe even 10 years ago, So what happens is I think it's healthier to deal with an issue at that point in time, because a lot of the time people will forget. When you hurt somebody or when you say something, a lot of the time we forget. People who say the mean things or the insensitive things, they never even remember what they are saying until they are called out. So if I start bringing an issue a year or 2 or 4 years later, it can take them aback and it can then affect the relationship. However, I also still want to say, and I've said this again in past podcasts, even if you're going to bring an issue 10 years later, there is no right time to deal with a problem. A lot of us take our own journeys with dealing with hurt and dealing with communication, and it's fine. However, which brings me to my point 3, we need to learn how to do conflict, right? We need to learn how to do conflict. So, like you can be this person who is sarcastic when you're dealing in conflict. You can be this person who's passive aggressive. You can be this person who is loud, again, because you never, like, I have people, I come from my family is, I always say, like, I always laugh at us and I say sometimes, you're not very good at dealing with conflict. And because our background was always very heated, we have people who are loud in the family, but on the flip side, we also have people who are very quiet, because sometimes the loud people would overwhelm the quiet people. And I was one of the people who was always very quiet. So you find that I learned to shut down, but there are people who, and I've even met people even out here in the business world, when they're dealing with conflict, they will yell at you, they will be abusive. We've seen really interesting exchanges happening during this Reject Finance Bill 2024 season on social media with our Gen Xers, who understandably have a lot of rage because of what's happening. But they're doing what I always never imagined I would ever be able to speak up the way they're speaking up to the leaders, and literally just dropping F-bombs directly at MPs and things like that. And that is the result of pent-up anger, pent-up emotions and things like that. So when I say we need to learn to do conflict, it means we need to work on ourselves. We need to begin to, if you even need to go on the internet and read on how can I have a safe conversation with somebody, I think it's important, because if you can, like I said, there are 2 ways you can handle conflict. You can handle conflict by being aggressive, by being passive aggressive, whichever type of aggression, or you can just do conflict by actually communicating what it is. So for example, instead of in a meeting, maybe you're in a meeting with somebody and you're removing negative comments, or you're saying things like, your hair looks, I don't know how today, or they say something and you're rolling their eyes. I mean, my daughter does that a lot. Sometimes she tells me I lecture her a lot, which I think many parents do in our journey to try and bring up sane children and progressive kids. So she tells me I lecture her a lot, right? And so when I'm lecturing her, sometimes she will roll her eyes, and I'm looking at her and I'm telling her, how are you rolling your eyes at me? Because in my days, and we always talk about in our past, the way our parents raised us, it was impossible to roll your eyes, because the minute you rolled your eyes at an adult, whether it was your parent, your mother, or an outsider, you knew that it was danger. Like you'd see red in their eyes. They'd come for you, right? So it's important that we learn to be non-combative when we are handling conflict, because that is the only way we will be able to effect change in another person who we are hoping needs to either change their behavior or needs to grow from whatever it is you're communicating to them. And also, it's a growing lesson for you. It's a growing journey for you as well. You end up becoming a better person. And remember, guys, on this podcast, I talk about life, love, and healing. But I'm really coming from a place of self-awareness in terms of we need to do better. We need to be better human beings for this world to really operate, right? And so here are the things that you should not do when handling conflict. And these are things I have also learned, because first of all, number one was really something that I used to do. I would automatically dismiss people. So and it could work either ways, like either I would just dismiss the problem because I'm like, I don't have time to deal with this. I don't have time. And many of us say that we don't have time to deal with issues, right? But really, we really need to deal with those issues. We can't keep running away, like I said. So I would be dismissive. Or I would face somebody who's being dismissive, which would then escalate the problem, right? So that's not the best way to do conflict. Or you become an avoidant. I mentioned that earlier. You avoid by all means. And the thing about being an avoidant is people don't realize this. But when you get used to avoiding facing somebody with your truth, what happens is it seeps into all other relationships that you have. So if you learned as a child to be an avoidant and to avoid conflict, then even as an adult, you're an avoidant. With your friendships, you're an avoidant. With your relationships with the opposite sex, maybe it's your boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, you become an avoidant, right? And for me, like I said, and I've said this before, I really struggled with speaking up. And I'm in my 40s. And guys, I just learned how to speak up properly. Like I've been, over the years, just gaining the courage, right? But nowadays, I learned in my 40s how to say no, for example. How to not say no by being passive aggressive or not talking, like the way you can be in a meeting. I don't know if you guys have ever been in a situation like that. You're in a meeting with people and they're giving you all these ideas, and in your head you're like, no, I don't want to participate in this, or this is not a good idea. But instead of saying it in the meeting, you leave the meeting and then you come back later and send a message and say, I don't agree. So usually that is very counterproductive. It is frustrating for the other people in the group. So it's important to be able to say things on the spot, right? And for me, what has happened is over the years, because of me being avoidant, either I lost relationships, meaning people walked away because they couldn't deal with my avoidance personality, or I walked away. I was like, I don't have time for this. And sometimes you're walking away, the way we say that, I don't need this person, I don't need these people, I don't need my family, I don't need my friends. Sometimes you get to that point where you're hurting so much and you're now blocking everybody. The reality is that we all need each other. We all need our family. We all need friends. You don't have to have many friends, but we all need that other person in our lives. So for us to run away from conflict means that we end up growing alone. And there have been so many instances where people we've had these conversations amongst my friends or amongst people where they're talking about loneliness and being alone. And I always look back and I think, when we complain about being alone or lonely or whatever, what really is the issue? Is it that we have not learned to speak up? We have not learned to develop the vocabulary to communicate our needs to other people? So that's what avoidance does, right? And something else, another point in handling conflict is forgiveness. I remember there was somebody, I did a post on my Facebook where I write a lot of my thoughts a lot of the time. And I did a post where this girl, I was talking about forgiveness, and I was giving people my story, as I always do, And I was talking about the way I learned to forgive, and it took me time. And somebody in my inbox came in and asked me, she's like, I get your post. It sounds amazing and everything. But really, right now, I'm struggling with anger and unforgiveness, And I remember just telling her, for me, this was a cliche response that I gave. And I kind of gave her a bit of my story on a personal level. And then I told her, you know what, at the end of the day, if you're a believer, because I am a Christian, right? And I always say, if you're a believer, then really the rules apply. The rule book which we follow, which is our Bible, says forgive 77 times, 7 times. And for me, that's usually a default response, but I do know that it doesn't answer people's question in terms of how to deal with forgiveness. So I would probably add that another way to deal with forgiveness, other than maybe going back to God and praying about it and praying, is to forgive yourself. not just to forgive the other person, but if you can't forgive the other person and you're struggling, forgive yourself for finding yourself in a very compromising situation that has caused you pain, or put you in the presence of someone who caused you pain, right? Because sometimes if you think through some of the challenges that we go through in life, or that we hold on to in terms of pain and unforgiveness, most of the times, not all, most of the times, it ties to the fact that we allowed ourselves, because of our fear of conflict, we allowed ourselves to sit in a situation for too long that was not favorable to us. And as a result, we got hurt. And because we are so focused on turning on to the other person and saying that person did A, B, C, D, we forget that we were the SI unit. Like, we were at the center of that conflict as well. So I think we need to look inward as well, like I said in a previous podcast, and we need to forgive ourselves and forgive the other person. And finally, if you know better, guys, if you know better, you do better. Because what I've seen is sometimes we are very, as human beings, and again, I'm going to go back to this reject finance bill situation, where we are finding the leaders, the reason why the Gen Zs and people in Kenya, some of them who are against the bill, that is, because of course there's some who are for the bill, which is weird. But yeah, is because there's some people, the leaders, are like, we do not care, right? They know that there are some things in this bill, for example, that are not good, but they're like, So my argument is, if you know, why aren't you doing better, right? So really, if you know, you must do better. It is no longer an excuse to act like you don't know. And this goes beyond politics, because this is not a political podcast. It's just that I'm doing this podcast during a very heated season in our country right now. But in our general lives, in our relationships, in our interactions with other human beings, with our families, with our friends, with our workmates, with our clients, our colleagues, a lot of us are just not doing better. A lot of us are just taking advantage of other people. A lot of us are causing unnecessary conflict because we are just bad human beings. Yeah. So guys, I think it's important that as we get to grow, as we get to advance in our lives, in our careers, in our relationships, that we just do better for each other. Yeah. So that's it for this podcast episode. See you soon, and thank you. As usual, subscribe, like, share. Thank you guys. Bye.